right, let's go ahead and get started. I have the Q&A box open, so I will be keeping an eye on that as well. Hi everyone, my name is Lisa Mason, and I work for Colorado State University Extension in Arapahoe County. I'm a horticulture specialist with a background in entomology. So talking about pollinators is one of my absolute favorite things, so I'm excited to be teaching tonight. If you're not familiar with Colorado State University Extension, we are the outreach branch of the university, and we have an office in nearly every county in Colorado. So if you're not familiar with your local extension office, I highly recommend checking it out and seeing what resources they offer in your community. We offer a wide variety of science-based education, research-based education, from a wide variety of topics. My specialty is, of course, horticulture, and that means we do things like diagnostics. So if you have a sick tree, or your lawn is dry, or you have a weird bug in your house and you don't know what it is, your tomato's not doing well, anything in the green growing in the landscape, or any insect and arthropod questions you might have, we offer that service in the community. And we are an unbiased resource too. So feel free to reach out to your county extension office and ask all those questions. I do have our website on the screen so you can navigate to your county. We also offer a wide variety of public programs, presentations, the Colorado Master Gardener program, and so on. If you enjoy this class, CSU Extension also has free webinars that some are upcoming live and some are pre-recorded. So check out the website on the screen too for more gardening related classes. CSU is an equal opportunity access university. So feel free to check out the website or let me know if you have any questions about that. All right, before we dive in, I want to learn a little bit more about who's in the audience. We have a couple of poll questions for you. So feel free to check out, it should pop up on your screen, and answer those questions so I can see how much gardening experience you have and how many species of bees that you think live in Colorado, and if you have a pollinator garden or not, or you want to build a pollinator garden. So we'll give just 1 minute to answer the questions. Okay. Allie, is there a way we can look at those results?
Yes. So I'm seeing them on my end. Maybe I end the poll and that's how they'll share.
I think so.
Yeah, cool. Give people a few more seconds. Ending it now. And I can share the results here.
All right, so it looks like for that first question, how much gardening experience do you have? About 42% say that you have some gardening experience. 38% are saying they have years of gardening experience. And we have about 20% that are beginners or don't have any gardening experience. For question 2, ooh, we have answers on the whole spectrum. So some people think we have 50 species, 100, 500. Only 13% said that we have over 1,000 species of bees. And that is the correct answer. We have over 1,000 species of bees in Colorado. So we're going to address that later on. We have an amazing amount of biodiversity, much that you get to see in your own landscape. So pretty cool. And then, do you already have a garden for pollinators? 65% say they've planted some some pollinator-friendly plants, but would like to expand their efforts. 13% already have an established garden, and 23% want to know where to start. Okay, that helps me learn a little bit about you and what you're interested in. So let's dive right in. Here's our agenda for the evening. We can do a short intro, and then we're going to just dive right into pollinator habitat best practices. Then we'll talk about how to build and where to start with a pollinator garden, How do you know if you are successful? And then we're going to talk about who's visiting your garden. So if you're adding all these plants, who might you notice? And we'll also talk a little bit about their biology too. So that will help connect the dots when you're building pollinator habitat for specific pollinators. Okay, so big picture, why do we care about insects? Well, in short, we can't survive without insects. Biologist E.O. Wilson, he estimated that humans would only be able to survive maybe a few months if insects were completely wiped off the planet. And besides pollinators, the benefits of insects go way beyond that even. They provide roles in every single ecosystem, and that includes benefits to humans. And so we know we need pollinating insects because they facilitate plant reproduction and they provide us food, but we also need decomposers. Those are the ecosystem cleanup crew. Can you imagine a world if we didn't have dung beetles in our ecosystem? Dung beetles recycle dung back into the soil, and they literally save the cattle industry millions and millions of dollars every single year from recycling all that dung back into the soil. So we need our decomposers. Predators. We have predatory insects that help keep our pest populations in check. We also have natural enemies against invasive species. One great example of that is there's ongoing biocontrol research for Japanese beetles. There are many places in Colorado that have pretty severe numbers, pretty high numbers of Japanese beetles, and that's real exciting to see. Insects also provide food for a lot of other animals, and in many parts of the world, insects are a vital protein source and a sustainable protein source as well. And then we also get a variety of products from insects, including honey, silk, shellac, and carmine extract, which if you wear red lipstick or a lot of our red foods like red velvet cake, that red color actually comes from an insect, a scale insect. But insects and arthropods are declining all over the world. One of the biggest reasons is habitat loss, combined with human activity. So we really need to make an important effort to conserve our beneficial insects, especially pollinators. And the silver lining with pollinator conservation is that everyone can be a part of the solution because pollinators need flowers, and many of us can plant flowers for pollinators. And I like that it can be something that everyone can contribute towards the solution for. So why do we care about pollinators so much? Well, in short, they pollinate a third of the world's food crops, and so that's about 1 in every 3 bites of food. Those crops are dependent on insect pollinators. It's about 80 different crops, and bees alone pollinate over $15 billion worth of crops every year. For the most part, this is our fruits, vegetables, and nuts, but it goes beyond that. One example is that bees pollinate alfalfa and clover, which are used to feed cattle. And so our meat and dairy industries are also dependent on pollinators. And from an ecosystem perspective, more than 75% of all the plants on Earth require pollinators for plant reproduction. And if the plants can't reproduce, we wouldn't have those plants. And the benefits of plants are endless in our ecosystem. So they do play a very important role in our world. Honeybees are probably the perhaps most well-known pollinator, and we rely on our honeybees for a lot of different crops, especially, but we also have a lot of specialist relationships. Now, a specialist relationship is a pollinator that only visits specific plants. And so some classic examples are bumblebees. Everyone has bumblebees in their gardens. They do something called buzz pollination, meaning when they land on a plant, they have a special vibration that actually releases the pollen from the plant. And no other bees can accomplish that. So plants that need buzz pollination are tomatoes and peppers and other vegetables in the Solanaceae family or the nightshade family. Cactus bees, it's almost cactus blooming season, and I highly recommend if you get a chance to observe a cactus flower, you will see an amazing amount of biodiversity in those flowers. And there are some bees that specifically rely on cactus flowers to complete their life cycle. They won't visit any other flowers. Squash bees are another great example of a specialist bee. Squash bees are native bees, and if you plant squash and pumpkin, they will come. They will find your squash flowers, and you have to go out in the early morning when those squash flowers are open, and you'll see those squash bees buzzing all around. Other bees may visit the big yellow flowers, but only squash bees can actually pollinate the squash and pumpkin plants. And then another one are yucca plants and yucca moths. This is the story of where one cannot survive without the other. So without yucca moths, we would not have yucca plants, and vice versa. Yucca moths, the female moths, are very smart. When they're on a yucca flower, they collect some pollen, and she tucks it under her little chin, and she holds some of it, and then she uses the rest of the pollen to pollinate the plants, and then she saves some of it to feed her larvae for when they hatch. So she's very smart, making sure that the plant has enough pollen to reproduce, but also her larva, her young, will have enough food to survive. So very interesting story. What exactly is pollination? Well, it's basically facilitating plant reproduction. And so when a bee or other pollinator, when she visits that flower, she has no idea she's doing the plant any favors. Basically, that bee she's visiting that flower for the pollen and nectar reward. Flowers have evolved to attract very specific pollinators. And so in that process, the bee is going to collect pollen and nectar, and in the process, pollen grains are going to stick to the hairs on her body. And then she'll fly to the next flower of the same species and deposit some of those pollen grains in the next flower. And that's essentially is plant reproduction. This could be a whole class in itself, but so this is a very simplified version of pollination. And when we don't have sufficient pollination, we don't have good fruit development, and or plants may not be able to reproduce. Colorado especially has taken an interest in pollinators. In 2022, legislation passed to give funding to the Colorado Department of Natural Resources to do a study on what is the status of pollinators here in Colorado? Because believe it or not, no legislation has passed like that before, and we've never had that information at our fingertips. And so after it passed, a group of scientists convened and looked at all the research that's been done in Colorado and looked at all of the management practices being done on federal agency, state agency land, private property, and they put together a fabulous 300-page report on what the priorities are for pollinator conservation here in Colorado. I highly recommend checking this out if you want to learn more. It's a great read. It's written it's not too technical, so it is an interesting read, and these are some of the priorities that came out of it. Protecting different habitats and educate and learn about pollinators, connecting fragmented habitats, all important strategies for pollinator conservation. So we're going to touch on all these pollinators tonight: hummingbirds, bees, believe it or not, wasps. I'm going to answer all your wasp questions. Flies, butterflies, beetles, moths, and bats. We're gonna circle back to this, but these are the beneficial pollinators that we are attracting to our landscapes. And so what do they need? How do we build habitat? All pollinators need food, shelter, water, and space, just like humans and just like other wildlife. We're used to seeing our green parks and open spaces. It's a beautiful green landscape, but this doesn't offer any resources for pollinators. In fact, when a bee sees the color green, it looks great to them. So it's probably similar to what pavement looks like to humans. So we got to get away from the sterile habitats, and this picture here in the middle is a better example of balance. So they want their turf grass, they have a nice balance of turf grass and flowers that provide habitat. So this is a great example, and really this picture here on the right is what we want to strive for even more. So this is going to be more of a xeric garden, lots of different wildflowers that's going to offer different nutrition, lots of sheltering spaces for those beneficial insects. It's not as well manicured maybe as the other pictures, but that's more I was gonna say messy. Messy isn't quite the right word, but that's what we want to go for because that's really what's going to provide habitat for our pollinators. Let's talk about food. Pollinators need a wide diversity of flowers to complete their life cycle. Each plant has a little bit different of a nutrition profile. So, having a diversity of plants is great. And you want to make sure you have flowers that bloom all season long. So, many plants, they might only bloom for a couple of weeks. And then, there might not be much blooming. So, you want to make sure that when you're picking out plants, have early blooming flowers in the spring. Have stuff that's going to bloom through the heat of the summer and all the way into fall. And that way, pollinators will have a sustainable source of flowers all season. You're also going to want to avoid double flowers. Let's talk about what a double flower is. It is a flower that was intentionally bred by horticulturalists to be big, bright, and beautiful and low maintenance. And that's exactly what it is. Here's a dahlia here that is a double flower. And in that process, they breed out the plant reproductive parts of the flower. So you essentially have a sterile plant. And so they are lovely. But in terms of providing pollen and nectar for pollinators, the flowers will not have that. It'll be a sterile plant. And so what can you do about that? First of all, if you love your double flowers, by all means keep planting them. But maybe consider adding some additional flowers that pollinators and other beneficial insects can utilize. Many of our common flowers, roses, hollyhocks, dahlias, all those have single flower varieties that are great for pollinators, and the double flower varieties that are do not provide resources for pollinators. So if you're wondering, is this good for the insects? Look inside. If you can see the plant reproductive parts, you can see the pollen. It might be a good plant. But if you look deep inside, some of these flowers, you won't find those plant reproductive parts. Native flowers are excellent options for pollinators. They've evolved with the native plants. So we know that they are nutritious and helpful. So you can't go wrong with native plants. There's also a lot of really great horticultural varieties out there as well. Now, this is a big area of research. Are horticultural varieties as good as the native varieties for pollinators? And short answer is we don't really know, but there's a lot of great varieties out there that pollinators are visiting. And so we have to assume, they know what they're doing. And if it was not a good plant for them, they may not, they would probably prefer other plants. So, add some horticultural varieties with pollen and nectar to your landscape. Okay, we also have something called plant pollinator syndromes. So these are different traits that plants have that attract their pollinators. This is by no means all inclusive, but it can be, you can look for traits in these flowers if you are hoping to attract a specific pollinator. So, for instance, bees are attracted to bright white, yellow, blue, or UV light. Generally, the flowers might have a mild or a fresh scent. A lot of the flowers are going to be a tubular shape, and some may have landing platforms for those bees to land on. Birds are attracted to scarlet, red, orange, or even white flowers. I've seen them go to some pink flowers before. They're usually going to be larger flowers, funnel shaped, where the hummingbird can easily get her tongue in to get some of that nectar. Butterflies are attracted to bright colored flowers, including reds, purples, whites, oranges. And a lot of those flowers are going to have long spurs. or the flower is going to have a landing pad and narrow tubes where they can get that pollen out of. And moths and bats, these are nocturnal pollinators, so they are active at night. They tend to go for pale colored flowers that open at night as well for that pollen and nectar. And bees actually see a little bit different on the light spectrum than people do. So they can see UV light. And so here's some examples of what flowers look like to a human versus what it would look like to a bee. And in each of these examples, like this white flower here on the right, doesn't that look like almost a bullseye? It's like the flower is saying, "Come here, come here." There's lots of pollen and nectar here, and so the bee will fly to that flower. Other flowers actually change color during the course of their life, and so when there's ample pollen and nectar, it'll be like a purple color to attract the bees. And then once the resources run out, it'll fade to a different color, so it won't be nearly as attractive to the bees. So very interesting how flowers, their marking patterns, their colors, they really have evolved to attract their specific pollinator. I'm going to share some plants in the next handful of slides. Please know this is by no means an all-inclusive list. There are so many great options out there. These are some of my favorites. I've been watching bees since 2016 through a community science program that I started, which I'll share more information here in a bit. So these are plants that I have personally observed a lot of bees and other pollinators on. So it can be a good place to start, but please know these are not all-inclusive lists. This first slide here are Plant Select plants. If you're not familiar with Plant Select, they are a collaboration between CSU and the Denver Botanic Gardens. And they propagate plants that thrive in our climate in the Rocky Mountains in the Intermountain West. And so they're beautiful and do well. Most are very drought tolerant as well. So about half their plants are native, half are not. Couple I'll point out, the penstemon varieties, Red Rocks, Pikes Peak purple penstemon really attract a lot of bumblebees. Moon carrot is perhaps my favorite plant. It is a non-native, but it attracts so many different types of beneficial insects, more than I have been able to count. So it's a really great pollinator friendly plant. Little Trudy catmint, that can be a great early season choice for honeybees and bumblebees. And coneflowers, Denver daisy, all attract a wide variety of pollinators. Here are some of my favorite native plant options. Just to highlight a couple, Rocky Mountain penstemon. I always see green metallic sweat bees, which I'll show you a picture here in a little bit. Blanket flower attracts all kinds of pollinators. Columbines, depends on what color columbine you have. If you have a red columbine, you're more likely to attract hummingbirds. Purple columbines will attract bumblebees and other bees. And white columbines will attract sphinx moths and other beneficial moths. Rabbit brush is a great late season option, and it's beautiful too. Rabbit brush can be a little unwieldy, so check out, there's a lot of great varieties that are smaller that are perfect for a backyard landscape. Purple prairie clover, I've seen all kinds of different bees on all different types of species. And all of these really attract a wide variety. And of course, there are other options out there as well. Blue Mist spirea is a bee magnet. Purple flowers, needs well-draining soil. It's a wonderful landscape plant. In terms of trees, linden trees are pollinator magnets as well. I would caution you though, if you do have Japanese beetles in your area, consider an alternative plant because the beetles do feed on linden trees, unfortunately. Northern catalpa trees are great options. There's a wide variety of fruit trees. A lot of our fruit trees are blooming right now. Red osier dogwood, and weeds. Unfortunately, pollinators are attracted to some of our weed species. Hold that thought, we're going to come back to that. Trees and shrubs can be great for pollinators. And now conifer trees specifically are not going to have flowers on them, but they provide shelter for butterflies and hummingbirds and a wide variety of bird species as well. So conifer trees can really be a nice addition to have that habitat space for pollinators. If you're looking for flowering shrubs, fern bush is another bee magnet. Rabbit brush, sand cherry, and cinquefoil are all excellent flowering options. If you decide to add a tree or a shrub to your landscape, regardless, just remember to think about the mature size of the plant. That's why we have so many giant blue spruces next to people's homes because they did not account for the mature size, most likely, of that blue spruce. So, good planting tip right there. Another thing you can add to the landscape that is helpful for pollinators are grasses. We have a wide variety of ornamental grasses that you can add that benefits all kinds of butterfly species and moth species. Ornamental grasses can also provide sheltering space for ground nesting bees and other ground nesting beneficial insects. So I have a couple of examples here. The taxile skipper is fairly common along the Colorado Front Range. This caterpillar hosts on a wide variety of bluegrasses of all things, which is, what our turf grass is typically made of, wheatgrasses, and other species. Other butterflies are and skippers are more specific. So here's the writings, satyr butterfly, and they host exclusively on blue grama. So many butterfly and moth species do host on the grasses, and grasses can provide great habitat spaces as well. Grasses can also be very complementary in your pollinator garden. So blue grommas, side oats grama, there's a lot of great options out here. Little blue stem is very popular. Big blue stem, June grass, prairie dropseed, a lot of great options, and they do benefit a wide variety of species. If you're interested in knowing more about what butterflies and moths you might have in your area and what host plants they need to survive, check out butterfliesandmoths.org. You can actually look at the species profiles for a butterfly or a moth species, and so you can learn about their caterpillar host plant. You can also look at county, state, and regional checklists. So here's a screenshot. These are the butterflies of Douglas County, Colorado. 174 species of just butterflies alone. So you can browse this list and see what host plants are needed to attract those butterflies and moths. Moon carrot, I gotta give another shout out just because it attracts so many different species. Now, we're gonna talk about wasps. There are some solitary wasps in this picture. These wasps are not the nuisance wasps. These wasps, the wasps that you see in this picture, keep to themselves. They do not sting, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. We have some flies, and we have some yellow masked bees. This picture here on the far right, these are some of the native bees that we have here in Colorado, all on moon carrots. I want to give a few other examples too of just photos that I've taken of bees on a wide variety of different plants. So here we have a sage, and look at that queen bumblebee sticking her tongue to get that nectar. And so you can see the pollen on her body too. So see how this part of the flower is actually touching the bee's body? Flowers are very savvy in helping the pollinators carry that pollen. On the right here, we have a green metallic sweat bee inside an evening primrose flower. On the left here, we have little Trudy catmint, which is at a Cherokee ranch. It was planted in an ornamental garden. Here's an early season mason bee. And then on the right, we have a plant called red feathers. This is a bumblebee, and look at all the packed pollen on her hind legs. Here we have a sweat bee in a columbine, a yellow columbine flower. And this is Red Rock's penstemon, another bumblebee, and she's got that packed pollen and nectar. A few more. We've got some foxglove. This is a wool carder bee, often seen around fuzzy plants because the female actually scrapes plant fuzz off of leaves and lines her nest cell with them. Here we have a little mason bee on an ice plant. And then the far right, we have a sunflower bee. And look at those hind legs, just packed with pollen, visiting those Tennessee purple cone flowers. So to attract bees, we need a variety of flowers, but we also need habitat space, and that means bare soil. Most of our bees nest underground or they live in cavities, which is a pre-existing tunnel. And so making sure we're leaving areas of bare soil in our landscape, especially if it gets a lot of sun, can be very helpful for pollinators. Reducing mulching can help as well. Now, mulch is a great addition to the landscape. So mulch offers a wide variety of benefits. Weed control, holding in the moisture for our trees, and it can be beautiful too. So do add your mulch, but maybe consider some areas where you can do less mulch because the bees won't really dig through thick mulch to nest. They'll find somewhere else to nest. So it's a balancing act for sure. If you have stems that are hollow, you can leave those throughout the winter, and some of our cavity nesting bees may take up residence there throughout the summer. So if you see them, leave them over the fall and winter so they can complete their life cycle. Wildscaping, mimicking nature, having that more of a not perfectly manicured landscape style can also go a long way just to provide sheltering spaces for those bees. And double benefits, if you're adding pollinator habitats, you're also adding low water landscape plants, most likely too. Bees and other insects need water. So you'll see here the bees are in the dish, are drinking water from the dish. So a bird bath, or if you have another shallow container, put some rocks in it, give some landing places for those bees to drink water. Now, if you do add water to your landscape, be sure you clean it out and refresh the water every couple days because you don't want to provide mosquito breeding grounds. So keep that water flowing. And I think we have to be creative about where we're putting in pollinator landscapes. So we might often think of our backyards, but we're going to have to think about our HOA spaces, parks, and other places where pollinators can live that where we might not be directly using the land. If you want to specifically attract butterflies and moths, you're going to want to plant the host plant for the caterpillars. The adults will drink nectar from flowers, but each species of butterfly and moth is different host plant for the caterpillars. So knowing what those host plants are, you can attract the butterflies and the moths, beneficial moths. In this picture here, I have a two-tailed swallowtail adult drinking nectar from a penstemon. Here's that caterpillar, and the caterpillars for two-tailed swallowtails host on ash trees and chokecherry. Well, we know with ash trees, emerald ash borer, an invasive beetle, is killing ash trees here in Colorado. It's spreading slowly, but in a lot of areas, it's been confirmed and it's found. It's actually been in Colorado for about 10 years now. So eventually, we're going to lose a lot of our ash trees. So in that case, their alternative host plant is chokecherries. So adding a chokecherry plant can be great for these butterflies. Also, provide nectar for a lot of bees and other insects, and the berries will feed the birds in the late summer. So that's one example of one species. Native plants are important for butterflies and moths specifically because caterpillars cannot just change their host plants. A lot of our pollinators that visit flowers are generalists, meaning they'll visit a wide variety of flowers, but caterpillars, they have a specific host plant. So that's where native plants can be especially beneficial. Butterflies and moths also need open sunny areas and places to shelter from the wind. So that's where we think about shrubs and conifer trees and adding layers into our habitats. And water. Butterflies, of course, need a water space. You often see male butterflies drinking water from mud puddles. They get trace minerals from mud puddles. So you could consider adding that to your landscape as well. covering plants. Why would I suggest covering plants? If you happen to have a welcome butterfly or moth species in your landscape, you might consider putting, covering it for a few days with a net, letting those caterpillars complete their, develop into their cocoon or chrysalis, because the European paper wasp is an invasive species. That's the wasp that builds the papery nest cells, in our house eaves and our sheds. And they are preying on all our butterfly and moth caterpillars. We've actually seen in the last 30 years pretty steep declines in our butterfly and moth populations from the predation of the European paper wasp. So if you do happen to have monarch caterpillars on your milkweed or swallowtail caterpillars, you may consider covering them just to help ensure that they can complete their life cycle. Depends on how into that you are or not. This is certainly an optional task, but if you enjoy observing them, it can be a great thing to do. Here's an example. This is the variegated fritillary butterfly. A gentleman called the extension office because he had all these caterpillars feeding on expensive pansies that he had just purchased. So I knew they were butterflies, so he was kind enough to bring them to the extension office. I bought them their own pansies, and they were able to complete their life cycle. So I then they completed their life cycle in the butterfly cage, and then I released them in my backyard. So knowing the species is, of course, very important. Hummingbirds. If you're hoping to attract hummingbirds to your landscape, planting red flowers is great. What's even better is planting flowers and plants that attract insects, because 70% of a hummingbird's diet is insects. And those hummingbirds cannot rear young without feeding the babies insects. And so flowers that provide nectar are outstanding. You can even take it a step further by planting nectar flowers so that the hummingbirds will have a wide variety of small insects to feed on. If you would like to add a hummingbird feeder to your landscape, by all means, please do. Hummingbird feeders are more for human enjoyment. They aren't necessarily a long-term sustainable resource for the hummingbirds. So have your hummingbird feeder, and also maybe plant some flowers that do help sustain their population through other insects. If you add that hummingbird feeder, remember it's a 4 parts water to 1 part water to sugar mix. And you'll want to replace that sugar syrup every few days. Hummingbirds also need a variety of trees and shrubs for shelter and water as well. Bee hotels can be a fabulous addition to the landscape. There's some great tutorials online. I recommend using a fact sheet from a university extension service. So pictured here is one from Michigan State University. Gives you all the science-based information on building your own bee hotel. The bee hotels are nice because you can watch bees complete their life cycle without the risk of getting stung. Mason bees, leafcutter bees, they are not going to sting. So can be very fun. A couple tips. One good method is the bee hotel is going to have to be replaced every year or two. So this example in this picture here, the structure is in place and will stay there, but all of these logs, all of these wood blocks can be taken out and replaced. And this is a great method for making sure that bee hotel stays free of pathogens, mold, fungus, and all the bad stuff that we don't want for our bees. Make sure it has a back end. You want to make sure those tubes are at least 5 inches long. A lot of the big box stores, the chain stores sell bee hotels, and those tubes are not long enough. So make sure they're at least 5 inches long. And there's some other great best practices as well in the fact sheet. If you happen to come across an insect hotel like this one, see the slots in the wood? They market these as butterfly homes, and butterflies do not nest in these. They would much prefer to take shelter from the winds in a tree or a shrub. There's been research, their butterflies just don't use these spaces. So don't buy a bee hotel with butterfly slots, or if you do have the slots, cover them up with duct tape or something, because what is going to take up residence are those European paper wasps, and that's what's preying on our butterfly species. So consider sealing that entrance off so they don't have a chance to make a nest. You may see leafcutter bees. Look at these circle shapes in the leaves. Not to worry, that's not going to hurt your plant at all. That is a sign that you have some wild native bees called leafcutter bees, and the female actually uses these leaf pieces to line her nest. Now, if you start to see these little notches on your plant, that's probably root weevil damage, and that's a different story. So be sure to call your local extension office if you suspect, you've got these little notches. But leafcutter bees do not harm your plant at all. Okay, let's talk about weeds. Should you leave the weeds? I'm sure we've all seen this on social media. Part of my weeds, I'm feeding the bees. Let's dive into that. Not all weeds are created equal. Some weeds are noxious weeds and will outcompete other plants in the landscape and really can be a detriment to ecosystem health. Other weeds maybe are non-native and they spread, but they aren't a noxious weed necessarily. So this all depends on the weed species that is there. If you have a noxious weed, do your best to eradicate that. In terms of dandelions, bees often do visit dandelion flowers, but research shows that the bees do not prefer dandelions. They actually prefer to go to other flowers because the dandelion pollen isn't as nutritious as other pollen sources. So if you left your dandelion flowers, it's not the worst thing in the world. Go for it. But to provide a long-term sustainable source for those bees, planting early season flowers is going to be a step that's better for the bees. The other consideration with this is if you do choose to use herbicides or anything for weed control, make sure that there are no flowers present. Cut off those flowers so that way the bee does not come into contact with that herbicide. Mow your lawn, for instance. No mow May. How does this fall under pollinator habitats? This is gaining traction. No mow May is where for the entire month of May, you don't mow your lawn. And we actually discourage this. First of all, here in Colorado, there's not a lot of flowers that are going to bloom in your lawn. You may have some dandelions, maybe you have some clover flowers, but it's not going to be extensive to not mow your lawn. And if you don't mow your lawn for the entire month, that's not in the best interest of your turf grass either. Turf grass, they're focused on the top growth in the springtime, and for healthy turf grass, they need to send some resources to those roots too. So keeping your grass mowed at 3 inches really is ideal for the health of your turf grass. So instead of not mowing your lawn, the better thing, plant those early season flowers. Leaving the leaves, is this a thing? This actually is helpful. Queen bumblebees and other insects and arthropods overwinter in leaf piles. So leave the leaves, get them off your lawn because it's not healthy for your lawn, and line your perennial beds, your vegetable garden, underneath your trees. That can be all great places to leave the leaves. And that will provide shelter for insects or pollinators and arthropods. Climate change. I think this is worth mentioning because the best thing we can do to help our pollinators is to plant more flowers. We are seeing different scenarios with climate change. Bees generally like warm temperatures, so a lot of our generalist bee species will probably do fine. Where we're going to see struggles are at high elevation. So high elevation bumblebees, as temperatures warm up, their populations might struggle. We're also going to see a phenomenon called phenology mismatch, which means pollinators are evolved to visit flowers, and they emerge when those flowers start blooming. If flowers start blooming earlier, but the pollinator emerges at the same time, there's not going to be the same overlap. And so the best thing we can do in that situation is plant more flowers, especially those early blooming flowers. Okay, and in terms of pollinator habitat, this is just the beginning. When you start adding pollinator-friendly flowers, you're going to attract a wide variety of beneficial insects that control pest populations, and you'll start to see these wonderful things in your landscape. Here on the left, the top right photo is a baby ladybug, a larva of a lady beetle. So most people see this and like, ew, I should kill it. No, these are ferocious aphid eaters. Lady beetles go through a full metamorphosis. So here's the adult and she's eating an aphid right there. So great additions for our gardens. You might also see lacewings. So that's the center photo right here. You've got a lacewing larva. Look at those pinchers used to take down aphids and other soft-bodied insects. You might come across some lacewing eggs. And this top left photo right here, this is a milkweed longhorn beetle. You're only going to see these beetles if you plant milkweed. They feed on the milkweed roots, but they don't harm the milkweed. They have a very symbiotic relationship with milkweed. So pollinator habitat supports a lot more than just pollinators. You're also going to attract birds and other wildlife species. Black-capped chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to rear one clutch of chickadees per year. Hummingbirds, like we talked about, need those insects as a major part of their diet. So once you add pollinator habitat, you're going to see some wonderful things. All right, I'm going to pause for questions. The first one is, I recently read that there are some dahlias that can be pollinator friendly. Yes, that is correct. But not all varieties are treated equal. So you'll have to do a little bit of research on which varieties will attract pollinators. The next question is, are cultivars like Cheyenne Gaillardia generally okay for pollinators? Not all plants are created equal, and so it's hard to make a generalization that, oh yes, all varieties are great for pollinators. So you'll have to try it and see. I haven't personally seen insects on Cheyenne Gaillardia, but I haven't planted that or observed it very much either. So I would give it a try and look for those pollinators, look for those insect visitors on the plant. Okay, and I'll answer one more. Would you be able to share the slide deck with us? So we are recording this and you will be given the recording. I don't think we specifically provide the slide deck, but I do have a resource sheet to share with everybody after this. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second on the questions so we can keep going. Grab a quick sip of water. Okay, so now that we know some of the best practices for pollinator habitats, let's put it into practice. And how do you get started with your own garden? Okay, so when talking about installing a new garden, our goal is to provide you with knowledge and the pros and cons and options. So do keep in mind there is no silver bullet or perfect solution. You have to find the right balance that works for you. Also note, I would avoid the all or nothing mentality. Some people want to rip out all the turf grass in their lawn, and that's great. But for other people, it might be better to start with bite-sized pieces and maybe add some new pollinator-friendly plants each year instead of doing a whole landscape transformation. So you really got to figure out what works for you and what you would like to see in your landscape. Maybe you're an avid birder and you want to attract hummingbirds, or maybe you want to attract bees. Maybe you're a vegetable garden person and you want to attract black swallowtails that feed on dill and parsley. There's so many things to consider. So think about what the low-hanging fruit is in your own landscape. And we recognize it is not easy to garden in Colorado. Between our alkaline soils, the crazy weather we have sometimes, low humidity, and lack of water, we realize it is a challenge. But hopefully we're going to talk about how to make that a little bit easier. Colorado is a semi-arid climate. And so when we think about pollinator habitat, we want to think about plants that would naturally grow well here. And we'll talk about a little bit about xeriscape here in a second. So when you're installing or considering pollinator gardening, the same practices apply if you're installing a xeriscape garden or any Waterwise gardening, because those plants are going to be pollinator friendly as well, and you're likely going to be adding habitat spaces for them. So when we talk about xeriscape, this is not what we mean. This like solid rock landscape. Please know, that's not helpful for the bees, the birds, the butterflies. It's not helpful for anyone. So this is not xeriscape. We can add some gravel to the landscape. Gravel can be a great mulch, but we certainly want to add plants and make it more lively than just a rock or a desert landscape. And pollinator gardens can help you save on your water bill. Depending on how much turf you have and how much water you're using, you can save a lot of money. Generally, the plants are low maintenance. There's not a lot of pests that impact pollinator friendly plants. And there's a lot of great aesthetic options available. So we're going to walk through each step to setting up your own pollinator garden. Planning and design, soil improvements, efficient irrigation, plant zones, mulches. We're going to touch on how lawns fall into this, and maintenance. Okay, so step one, planning and designing. Get to know your landscape. Get to know where the water runs off. Does it soak in? Notice the exposures to the sun. Like the south and the west exposures are going to use the most water. And look for places in your current irrigation system that really just aren't running efficiently. Run your irrigation system. If you see it running off, on the slope to the street, that might be an area that maybe that would be a good place to remove the turf grass and add some pollinator friendly landscaping. So really get to know the nooks and crannies of your own landscape. And you can start to put together a design like, oh, this area just wastes a bunch of water. Maybe this would be a good place for pollinator friendly plants. And you also want to think about what pollinators you'd like to attract, because there are a wide variety of pollinators that you can attract. And you want to consider your time and money too. So this is where like bite-sized pieces might be a better option. Make sure to check with your HOA, or better yet, advocate to the HOA that they should install pollinator habitat in community areas, community green spaces. And consider microclimates. Do you need full sun plants? Do you have a lot of wind? Is there a lot of exposure from the wind? Where the plants next to buildings get extra heat from the buildings. So consider, what type of plants that you need. What are those microclimates? And think about how you use your landscape. If you have children and you have dogs, you might want to keep some of your turf grass as a play area. And you might have other areas of turf grass that are being watered that you're not using at all. And so really understanding like what are your own personal goals is a great place to start when planning for your own personal landscape. I like this image because anyone, and this is a great thing to do, go to Google Earth and print out, the area of your own property, and map out how you use it and what you want to use it for. Maybe you take it one side of the house at a time and install low water pollinator friendly plants. Maybe you add a vegetable garden or add some xeric shrubs. Think about how you can map out your own place. And after you do that, well, and I kind of mentioned this already, but where's that low hanging fruit to start? The next thing you want to think about are the soil, or is the soil. A lot of Colorado soil is either clay or sand. And that makes a difference because clay, the water is going to sit in there for a while, whereas sandy soils, the water is going to run through. So a well-draining plant may not do as well in clay compacted soil. Something to keep in mind in your plant selection. Also, keep in mind that native plants typically don't need amended soil. When we start a vegetable garden, we have to add an amendment. We have to add that organic matter. Native plants don't need that. They're well adapted to growing in Colorado soil. Non-native plants, possibly could need amendments. And so you want to look at that and group plants based on the soil in your own landscape. If you do need to amend a soil, you can amend it, if possible, by hand into that first 6 to 8 inches if needed. And beware if you do add compost or anything of the high salt levels that can be present in the compost. If you have no idea what your soil is like in your landscape, you could consider a soil test. That will give you, that will tell you the salt level, the pH, give you the overview of the organic matter and all the nutrients, and will provide recommendations on what you want to use that area for. So consider getting a soil test. CSU does have a soil test. They are a little bit slow right now. So if you want a pretty quick and fast turnaround, other great options are Ward Lab out of Kearney, Nebraska, and Wells Lab out of Greeley, Colorado. And we do have some fact sheets, and you can always ask your local extension office questions about your soil or how to interpret your soil test results. And I always like to add this in. Pine needles do not change the pH of your soil. That is a myth, and that is not true. It's really hard to change the pH of a soil, and pine needles do not do it. If you start to notice that you don't have plants growing underneath a pine tree or a spruce tree, it's probably because there's not enough sunlight under there to reach those plants. So you can always try shade tolerant plants, or trees need a lot of water, so maybe give them their space and don't plant anything directly underneath the tree. But yeah, very common myth out there. Okay, step 3, irrigation. Irrigation can be one of the more challenging parts of it, and this is where mapping out your landscape will be really helpful. If you do keep some of your lawn, you want to make sure that you've got that irrigation system working well and efficiently so you can continue to water your lawn. But for your trees, shrubs, and flowers, that's where you can look at drip irrigation. Um, or bubbler emitters is another great option for releasing water slowly into the soil. Depending if you have a small landscape, you might even be able to use a soaker hose and, have put that soaker hose out in your landscape yourself and run it on your own. When we think about, oh, I don't have to water as much anymore because my pollinator friendly plants are drought tolerant. Remember that all plants need water to get established. So you still might have to water those plants for the first 1 to 3 years or so, and then you can start to lessen the water on those pollinator friendly plants. And remember to water deeply, but you don't have to water often once they're established. Plant zones. And so this is where you'll want to group plants together that have similar growing conditions. Look for the amount of light that they need, what type of soil that they need, and group plants together accordingly. You can also group plants together based on how pollinator friendly they are. If you're looking to attract bees, for instance, bees will visit the same when a honeybee leaves the hive, she's going to visit the same species of plant on that run before she goes back to the hive. So planting in groups of 3 to 5 can be great for a lot of our bees. And consider what you're using your landscape for too. So, if you do have children, maybe put the pollinator friendly plants away from the play area. Or, if you've got thorny plants, keep those away from the play area, things like that. Okay. And then we talked about plant selection for pollinators. Native plants are always a great option. Avoid those double flowers, plant a variety of species, and consider the caterpillar host plants. And then consider your own personal preferences too. There's a wide variety of sizes, colors, textures. Winter interest. One of my favorite plants for winter interest is rabbit brush. I think rabbit brush is beautiful all year around. Okay, and the next step is mulch. So, like we said, mulch offers some great benefits in the landscape, but consider where you use the mulch and where you don't use the mulch. And if you can, leave some bare, sunny areas that receive a lot of sun, and see if you can attract some of those ground nesting bees that won't sting. Um, Bees will also nest in rock mulch as well. Just make sure no landscape fabric. Landscape fabric doesn't really work to suppress weeds anyway, and bees and other insects are not going to nest. They're not going to cut through that landscape fabric. If you're considering areas where to put pollinator habitats, look for areas of lawn like this. So this little piece of turf grass here really is serving no purpose. Most of that water is running off into the sidewalk and the street anyway. This would be a great option it's a small area, rip that turf grass out and add some drought tolerant, pollinator friendly plants. You could do a low ground cover, you could do some small perennials or maybe even some small shrubs. This would be a great place to do that. So consider where you're using your turf grass. If there's traffic, foot traffic, pet traffic, and decide what to do with your lawn from there. And then maintenance. The nice thing about pollinator friendly landscapes is that there isn't a lot of maintenance. You will have to do some weeding, probably, just like everywhere needs weeding, but generally low maintenance. And those plants, you might, if you add a whole bunch of plants, not all of them may survive. So add some new ones each year. And even if they're small at first, remember to consider the mature size of the plants because they will grow into that area. And you'll want to replace that mulch every few years too, just to keep it looking nice. Okay, I'm gonna pause for questions. What about rock mulch for pollinators? Rock mulch is great. I see sweat bees, green metallic sweat bees, and other ground nesting bees in rock mulch all the time, as long as there's no landscape fabric. But if that soil's poking through a little bit, yeah, that can be a great area for ground nesting bees. What are the most nutritious flowers? That is a hard question to answer. With dandelions, that they had a very specific study to see because we know dandelions are a weed and they wanted to know. And it turns out the bees did choose other plants than dandelions. The vast majority of flowers, we know there's different nutrients and different nutrition profiles. That's why just adding a variety is your safest bet. So we can't really say which plants are more nutritious than others. Native plants are always a great option too for nutrition. Okay, and we'll do one more. If you leaves the leaves, is it okay to chop or mulch the leaves? Um, if you have big piles of leaves, there could already be consider there could already be insects overwintering in those leaf piles, and so if you mulch them, it's possible you might be mulching whatever has been sheltering in those leaves. But you could also, if you did mulch those leaves and then add it to your landscape, you could provide sheltering habitat for other insects as well. So mulching leaves probably isn't ideal, but if you did choose to mulch, you could certainly add that mulch to the landscape for other pollinators as well. Good question. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but I promise we'll get to more questions at the end. I just wanted to touch one little bit more on turf grass. A lot of people, there's a movement to reduce turf grass because it is the largest crop that we have in the United States, believe it or not. We have over 40 million acres of turf grass. And so it does help pollinators and other beneficial insects to consider removing at least small areas that you're not using. If you do keep your turf grass, and I have a dog, we love to play frisbee on our lawn. We have pollinator friendly plants all around our landscape, as well as some trees. But we do have our space that we like to play with our dog. Make sure you check on that irrigation, because saving water just helps the ecosystem in general. So doing an irrigation audit can actually go a long way. This is another picture with balance when we think about turf grass. But consider um, making sure you're following the best practices for watering and for management. And so this is where self-irrigation audits can save on your water bill hugely. So get little containers, all the same size, and put them around your landscape. Run your sprinkler system this spring and then do it again in the fall, however often you want, and look for where those gaps are. If you have brown spots in your lawn, chances are you may have some irrigation gaps. And our sprinklers get beat up from time to time. And so irrigation audits can go a long way for water conservation. Um, this is an example. So if one cup has zero point 0.1 inch and this cup has zero point 0.2 inches, consider over the course of the summer, this 0.1 inch cup, I mean, that area is getting half the amount of water that the green area is. And so like in this picture here, this is all the brown grass that's just not getting enough water in the area. And so adjusting the sprinkler heads to water more efficiently can go a long way. Your extension office can always help with that as well. And I think it's important to mention tree care too, because healthy trees benefit pollinators, wildlife, and people. So as we look at adding more drought-tolerant plants to our landscape, we might be watering less, but we cannot forget about our trees because our trees need that supplemental water. They've been relying on it all these years, and so no matter what drought tolerant landscaping you're doing, remember to prioritize watering your trees if you want to keep those trees healthy. So whether you're hand watering or drip irrigation, don't forget your trees. And if you are considering a new irrigation system with your drought tolerant landscape, remember with your trees, watering around the drip line, which is where sorry, right here where it says irrigate. So you want to water around the tree canopy, like on the ground. And the roots extend out, even twice the length of the height of the tree. So this is really a great place to irrigate here is the drip line. Other care practices, consider mulch around your tree, especially if you are doing drought tolerant waterwise landscaping. Adding mulch can hold in the moisture a little bit longer as well. All right, so I'm going to pause for one more question real quick. The peppers I mentioned earlier, does that include chili peppers? Yeah, any peppers, they're in the nightshade family, the Solanaceae family. There are varieties of peppers and tomatoes that can self-pollinate. So it might not be every single variety, but many pepper varieties do require buzz pollination. Okay, I'm going to keep going. So you've added pollinator-friendly landscaping, and I'm actually going to skip ahead for a little bit. I'm looking at the time, and I want to cover some other things, but so I'll cover this here very quickly. If you add pollinator-friendly landscaping, think about what your goals are, and that's how you can determine if you're successful. Are you hoping to attract monarch butterflies or those wild bees? Write down your goals, and then put your scientist hat on and start observing in your landscape because you're going to start to notice really wonderful things. And that can be a way to evaluate your landscape each year and add and change the following year. And you'll have to be patient too. New plants do take a while to get established. So consider, this first year you might not see a lot of pollinators, but in years to come, you'll see more and more. I would highly recommend documenting what you're observing. Write down the number of bees, what butterflies you're seeing. Try to get pictures so you can identify them. You can always call, send me pictures and I'll try to identify it for you. And look for things for like if a plant attracts a specific species of bee or a specific butterfly, write all that down. And feel free to, you could quantify your observations as well. As scientists, when we look at documenting biodiversity, we look for richness, which is the number of species in an area, and we look at abundance. That's the number of individuals. And then, we look at diversity as it's an index and it's a measurement over time, how biodiverse is an ecosystem. You can use this as some guidelines in your own landscape, looking at the number of species and number of individuals over time. And if you want to go extra far, consider participating in community science. There are so many great projects out there. So if you're documenting the biodiversity in your landscape, iNaturalist is awesome. You can just upload a photo and uses AI technology to help you identify it. Once your observation is uploaded, experts from around the world can look through those observations and they'll tell you if it's correct or not. It's a great community. If you're particularly interested in bees, there's a ground nesting bee project on iNaturalist. If you find a ground nesting bee nest, please take a picture of it and submit it to iNaturalist. Bumblebee Watch is specific for bumblebees. And if you go to scistarter.org, there are all kinds of community science projects for citizens. I personally run Native Bee Watch, which is a community science program here in Colorado. We actually have our first training tomorrow, and we will have one next week. You can also watch the recorded training, and we basically train you to identify bees into 8 different categories. You can watch bees in your home landscape and report that data. So we would love to have all of you involved. Just visit nativebeewatch.org to learn more or send me an email. And we actually just got a grant that's going to take our volunteer training a step further. We're using AI technology to develop a volunteer tutoring model to help volunteers learn to identify bees with more accuracy. The more accurate our data is, the more we can do with that data. So we're in for an exciting season this year. All right, I'm going to take a quick break. Okay, we've got a little more time. I'm going to save questions for the end. So let's talk about who you might see in your garden. These are the major categories of pollinators. Uh, Bee diversity, like I said, in Colorado, we have over 1,000 species. So actually my slide is now out of date. That 1,000 number is a more recent number. Over 1,000 species. Worldwide, we have about 20,000 species. And to understand how to attract bees to our landscape, it's important to know what their life cycle is. So I'm going to touch on 3 life cycles real quick. Eusocial bees. These are our social bees. And the only species we have really that's truly eusocial is our honeybee in North America. Honeybees are actually a non-native species. They were introduced in the 1600s here in the United States, and they are a managed and domesticated species. They are very similar to any livestock species. And so what does that mean? That means honeybees are not at risk of extinction. We breed honeybees, beekeepers buy honeybees. They can replace those bees since they are a domesticated species. In terms of all of our wild bees, those other 1,000 species, they are wild and they are at risk of population decline, and some species may face the threat of extinction in the future. So very nuanced in how we manage those bees. Social bees, like our honeybees, do have queen workers and drones, which are the males. They have a queen. She's the only one that lays eggs. When bees reach a certain age, about 9 or 10 days old, they actually become nurse bees and they tend to the developing bees, the baby bees. Most of our bees are not social. They are actually solitary. We talked about how the bees live underground or in pre-existing tunnels. They do not interact with any other bees other than mating. And so that female is going to collect pollen and nectar. She packs that nectar and pollen into a tight ball called bee bread. And she lays one egg on that bee bread, seals up her nest cell, and does it again and again and again. So that little baby bee has all the provisions she needs or he needs to become an adult bee. So they overwinter. Here's some bees emerging from their underground nests, vastly different than the honeybee life cycle. Here's some examples of bee nests. So this is a leafcutter bee nest. On the right here, we have a bee hotel with a little mason bee, and 70% of our bees nest underground. So quite often you're going to see holes that look like little ant holes, and quite often those are underground bee nests. So if you come across this, pause and see who is going in and out. Solitary bees do not sting, so you do not have to worry about getting stung. Bumblebees have a slightly different life cycle. The queen bumblebees overwinter in a pile of leaves, in a pile of logs. They overwinter as an adult bee. They're the only bee that overwinters as an adult. When spring comes, the queens are out flying right now. She's going to find a place to build a new colony, and she's going to lay worker bees all season long till about midsummer when she lays eggs that are females and males. They will go and leave the nest. They will find a mate. And then once winter comes, her current colony will come to an end, and the only surviving bees will be those newly mated queens. All right, here's your pop quiz. I know it's getting late, but this is always kind of fun. Am I a bee, a fly, or a wasp? So look at each picture and think to yourself, am I a bee, a fly, or a wasp? Most of these, I bet you don't know. All right, let's look. So the first 5 photos are actually flies. Believe it or not, and I promise I'll tell you why. Flies mimic bees and wasps because bees and wasps are stinging insects. And so if a fly can mimic a stinging insect, predators will avoid it. So I'll tell you how to the ID characteristics here in a second. Here we have a wasp, and then these last 2 pictures are bee species. So let's talk about how you tell the difference. Wasps have long, narrow bodies. They have no hairs and they do not carry pollen. They have long, curly antennae. So, and they have a wasp voice, this constriction here between the thorax and the abdomen. Some species are more pronounced than others. So, long, narrow bodies, no hair, and no pollen. Flies look for 2 things: giant fly eyes that come to the top of the head and a short, stubby antenna. If you can't see the antenna, it's probably a fly. So let's look back at our answer key. Oh, actually, and here's our bee characteristics. Bees are generally a more round and robust shape. They have hairs all over their bodies. They have a bend in their antenna. Their eyes are on the sides of their head. But bees are all sizes, shapes, and colors. Bees will also carry pollen too. So how can you tell the difference? Let's look at these first 5 photos. See the first 5 photos, the flies, they have giant fly eyes that go to the top of their head. Short, stubby antenna. This one's a little bit longer. But here, the furthest to the right looks like a yellow jacket wasp. But look at those eyes in the antenna. This is on my sunflower. I share this with you because there's so much misinformation and there's so much fear around stinging insects. And a lot of it is misinformation. And so, for instance, these flies that mimic bees and wasps cannot hurt you. They will not bite, they will not sting. They're absolutely harmless. And so you can start to recognize these flower visitors in your own landscape. Here's the wasp. Look at that long, narrow body, no hair and no pollen. Here we have the first bee. She does have hairs on her thorax and her head, that more compact shape, the bend in the antenna. She carries pollen on the underside of her abdomen. Many bees carry pollen on their hind legs. She's going to carry pollen on the underside of her abdomen. And then here we have a cuckoo bee. This is actually a parasites bee. So it's a bee that doesn't need to be a pollinator. And so this one's a bit of a trick question. She looks like a wasp, but she actually is a bee. Here's some other flies that mimic bees. So we've got our bumblebee and we have a robber fly. The robber fly was in Rocky Mountain National Park, even has the orange stripes on the abdomen. And I love this photo so much. Which one is the fly and which one is the honeybee? And the one on the bottom is the honeybee. She's even got pollen on her hind legs. And this top insect is a fly mimicking a honeybee. Pretty fascinating. Here's examples of some bees you might see in your own landscape. For size comparison, we do have a tiny little bee in a bindweed flower here, all the way to our queen bumblebees, which are almost an inch long. Each of these photos, you can look and see how the bee is carrying pollen. If you are interested in learning more about bees that will be attracted to your landscape, here's a QR code. You can also visit the extension website for a field guide that you can download. All right, I'm going to skip the next few slides here. All I will say about beekeeping is that beekeeping can be very rewarding. It's a great hobby. It will not help save the bees, though. If you really want to beekeep, there's a lot of great reasons to beekeep. If you want to help the wild pollinators, it's best to actually plant flowers and provide habitat spaces. And it is swarm season. So if you come across a honeybee swarm right now, don't be alarmed. Call the swarm hotline because there are beekeepers that will come and get those bees. They are an important pollinator. They just are not threatened of population decline. So is beekeeping the best way to save the bees? And the answer is no. In terms of our honeybees outcompeting our wild bees, that's a very complex question. In some cases, they can outcompete all the wild bees, and so we need to find a balance of both honeybees and native bees. So the question I always pose to someone who asks that are, what are the goals for the landscape? What are the goals for your property? If you're managing for conservation or if it's open space land, parkland, generally keeping honeybees is not going to be the best because you want to save those floral resources for the wild bees. In urban areas, in an agricultural setting, there's a lot more floral resources. And so keeping honeybees might be a more suitable option for those areas because there is a lot more floral density. So a lot of variables go into that. Take home message, all bees are important. It just requires different management strategies. All right, we do have flower visiting flies. I gotta say, our flower visiting flies provide double benefits for us. They are pollinators, and the larval form of these flies feed on aphids and other pest insects. So they are excellent pollinators and excellent beneficial insects in our landscape. You might also come across bee flies, which are other pollinating flies. All right, I'm going to touch on wasps. We have about 6 minutes left. Let me actually look and answer a couple more questions. I do want to get through wasps because I always get so many questions on them. And then we'll wrap up, but I'll see if I can answer one question real quick. Does CSU Extension utilize any citizen science apps like iNaturalist? Researchers all over the world use iNaturalist. CSU Extension, well, I personally use iNaturalist for a hobby, and I try to contribute my knowledge to identifying species. That can be a great way to contribute to a wide variety of research projects. So iNaturalist for the win, absolutely. Okay. Looking for another. Is there a good app for identifying bees and other insects? Any app that can do photo identification has mixed reviews. Usually they can get sometimes an accurate answer. With most bees and other insects, it's hard to get to a species level. Most of the time we can't unless you get that bee under a microscope. So keep in mind that if humans can't identify insects to a species level, quite often, most of the time, apps are not going to be able to either, but it can get you closer to the identification. So maybe it'll tell you with the family it's in or the genus even, and that can be a good starting place, but I would confirm the answer. So if you get that answer from the photo ID app, do double check that and make sure it is correct. iNaturalist is excellent for that. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Gonna get back to our wasps. All right, so let's talk about safety and stings. Over 90% of all insect stings are caused by the Western yellow jackets. Honeybees can sting if they are provoked, but they can only sting once and then they die. The barb stays in your skin, and when the honeybee flies away, her insides are ripped out, and she's cannot survive a sting. So what does that mean? That's everyone says, ow, I was stung by a bee. When in reality, most of the time they were stung by a wasp. And so we've got to start changing that mentality of ow, I was stung by a bee, because most of the time that is simply not true. The Western yellow jacket is the most aggressive stinging insect that we have. And they are scavengers. They do not visit flowers for pollen and nectar. So that's huge when we think about adding pollinator habitat to our landscape. Adding flowers that attract bees does not increase the risk of stings, because all of those wild solitary bees and actually solitary wasps either cannot or rarely sting. And solitary insects, solitary bees especially, they don't have that colony to protect, so they don't have the same venom that a social insect like a wasp or a honeybee has. And so creating pollinator habitat does not contribute to the sting risk. Obviously, you want to be mindful of where you're putting plants. If you do have a lot of human activity, you got kids running around, but do know that the sting risk is not increased. Yeah, Western yellow jackets. Yes, they are aggressive and they are responsible for most of the stings, but they are the ecosystem cleanup crew. So they do have an important role and they feed on carrion, so dead things. Their role is to get rid of that bad bacteria out of the ecosystem. But when you add humans to the landscape, they are also attracted to human food sources. So trash cans, barbecues, picnics, anytime you see a yellow and black insect flying around human activity or human food, it is more than likely a Western yellow jacket. They're underground nesters, and so if you do come across their nest, be very careful because they can be very dangerous. They will defend their nest. Nests can be hard to find unless it's like right next to your house or other human activity. The best thing you can do if yellow jackets are a problem, get those yellow tube traps, the pheromone traps only. That's the key word. You want pheromone yellow jacket traps, and get them out now because the queens are emerging right now with the warm weather, and you want to catch those queens before she starts building a colony nearby. When people put the traps out in July, there's already like 200 wasps in that colony. So those yellow jacket traps can be so helpful. If you do come across a nest, do consider hiring a professional because they will defend their nest. Those nests are well protected underground too. So spraying wasp spray underground, it's just not going to do the trick. Insecticidal dust may be able to help, but maybe not. Varying effectiveness. So consider that. And then our other nuisance wasp species is the European paper wasp. This is the invasive species that's feeding on all our butterfly and moth caterpillars. These nests are always up higher. They're not ground level. They're going to be under our house eave or in our shed. And they are an invasive species. So this is where wasp sprays can be a great tool to manage them. Just be sure you're following all the safety, the label on the can, because you want it to be effective and you don't want pesticide drift, and you've got to protect yourself as well. Okay, we are at 8 o'clock. I have a few more slides to cover. Feel free to leave if you want, or feel free to hang on. We're about done, and then I'll touch on the questions in the Q&A. You may also come across wasps in these funnel-shaped nests. They're very common. Bald-faced hornets and aerial yellow jackets are two species that you'll see. Most of the time, people don't notice these nests until the leaves fall off the tree in the fall. But by then, and this is true for the other wasps too, they only live a 1 year life cycle. So when fall and winter come, yellow jackets, the paper wasps, and the wasps, bald-faced hornets, and aerial yellow jackets, all of the individuals die except for the newly mated queens. And so by the time people notice this nest inside their tree, those wasps are going to die anyway. So really, these don't cause a lot of harm unless someone's climbing your tree. So if you have children, it's good to be mindful. If you have a nest, a lot of times arborists will come across these nests. But if not, people usually don't know they're there. They will not sting or harm you unless their nest is threatened. And in addition to, so we talked about the sometimes nuisance wasp species. We have thousands of other species of wasps in our landscape, preying on pests, providing valuable services, and they rarely bother us at all. A lot of them can't even sting. So this wasp right here with the long, it looks like a stinger, that is an ovipositor. That is what she uses to lay her eggs inside the bark of a dead or dying tree. So she doesn't hurt the tree, but that's why she's got this long ovipositor. It's not a stinger, but it's very specialized for laying eggs. Most of these wasps you'll see in your gardens and your landscapes, and they're hunting spiders and crickets and small caterpillars, all adding value to our landscape. Here at the top left is a bright metallic green wasp. She's a cuckoo wasp looking for looking for other wasp species in a bee hotel. You might have solitary wasps in your bee hotel, and that's great because the solitary wasps in your bee hotel are not going to sting you. They aren't going to bother you in the least. And this is a great way, just like with our solitary bees, you can watch the wasp complete the life cycle without the risk of getting stung. And so in this picture here, this wasp is a grass carrying wasp. So you'll see the grass blades in the hole, and she's going to hunt crickets and feed her young crickets in that nest. Okay, should I keep going? We've got about 86 people left. Maybe I will address some of the questions. Will wasps return to their old nest from the previous year? No, they will always build a new nest. They do not return to the old nests year after year. Does CU come out and work with homeowners as to what would be a better place for a pollinator garden? Certainly reach out to your local extension office, Ingrid. If they can't do a site visit, they could certainly give you guidance on where might be a good place for a pollinator garden. So do reach out and see how they can help you, or reach out to me. All right. The next question is it okay to let my bluegrass lawn go dormant in the summer? It does turn brown, but it comes back after the rain. And that's exactly right. The grass will come back after a rain, but we will get hot, dry temperatures. And so you could certainly try that. Beware, weeds might take over. So you'll be prepared to fight the battle with weeds. One thing you can do if you want to just let your grass die, add mulch over it. Add a thick layer of mulch so the sun can't get through. And that can be an easy way. Just leave that turf grass there. Just pile the mulch on thick, and then you can add additional plants later on. Okay. With respect to pollinator nutrition, is it true that nectar is equivalent to a sugar carbohydrate and pollen is the equivalent to protein? Yes, that's exactly right. Pollen is protein, and nectar is sugar and carbohydrates for those insects. Absolutely. Pollinators, especially bees, need both, but may not get both from the same plant species. That is also true. So they might go to different plants for pollen and different plants for nectar. Absolutely. And that speaks to plant diversity in the landscape. Yep, great comment, Steve. Can you share your slides on trees? They went too quick and I did not capture the areas to water. Michelle, yes, I'll do that here in just a few minutes. The next question is, our grass is currently mostly weeds. How might you recommend getting rid of it? Weed killer or tiller? If you till the soil, you may bring up more weed seeds. So keep that in mind. There are a variety of different options. I don't have time to get to the options tonight. If you send me an email, we do have some free classes on different ways to remove turf grass. And we also have a couple fact sheets, and I'm happy to share that with everyone. So Shannon, send me an email and I'll also try and include that on the resource sheet. Okay, I'm hearing yes, please keep going. So I'm going to talk about butterflies and moths real quick. Okay, and then we'll wrap up. We talked about caterpillar host plants for those butterflies. Here are some examples. Monarch is attracted to milkweed. We talked about swallowtails. Black swallowtails host on dill, parsley, fennel, and carrots. Mourning cloaks are some of the earliest butterflies that we see. Willow, aspen, cottonwood, and elm. Painted ladies, tiger swallowtails all have different caterpillar host plants. We talked about the two-tailed swallowtail. Another one, if you live in the foothills of Colorado, near Scrub Oak, Keep your eye out for the Colorado hairstreak butterfly. It's purple and it hosts on Gamble Oak. So it can be very hard to observe, but if you're in the right place at the right time, you might be lucky to see the Colorado state butterfly. Here's the black swallowtail on some dill that was planted at one of our demonstration gardens last year. Some butterfly populations migrate, and their populations are often determined by host plant availability. So planting milkweed is always great for monarchs. And painted ladies also migrate, and they host on a wide variety of plants, thistles, sunflowers, and many, many others. Some moths you might see, we talked about the yucca moth, but you might be lucky enough to observe sphinx moths in your landscape. We have about 70 species in the western US. Each species has a different host plant. And so here's the Acumon sphinx moth that hosts on grape and Virginia creeper. We also have tomato and tobacco hornworms, which can be a pest in our vegetable gardens. Keep in mind, all the other hornworms do not feed on tomato and tobacco, or tomato plants. Only the tomato and the tobacco hornworm feed on those plants. And the white-lined sphinx moth, this is perhaps the most common one you'll see. Not a pest. They host on a wide variety of plants. Their native plant host is sand verbena. They'll also host on grape, elm, and other plants as well. We do have some pest moth species, but we also have a lot of beneficial moth species too. Miller moths are technically pollinators, but we know they're a nuisance too. So consider putting those moths outside if they get into your house or sealing up your house. This is another pest moth that sometimes we see, the lilac ash borer, very common in ash trees. It is not emerald ash borer. So if you have questions about this, please let me know. And I think on that, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to skip here to the end. Please call your local extension office if you have any additional questions. Please keep learning. These are a couple of my favorite books. We'll send out the resource sheets and I'll address any other additional questions. Thank you all for hanging in there with me tonight. I know I went over and I sure appreciate your time.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Just wanted to pop in. That was awesome, Lisa. Super helpful. And I was also excited for you to keep going. So that is great. So thanks, everyone, for staying here. Yeah. And let us know if you have any questions as well. I just want to pop in to say you'll receive, when you leave tonight, you'll see a link for the survey. If you could let us know how the talk went. If you've also attended others, webinars, we'd like to hear about how those went too. So be sure to fill that out. That'd be really helpful. But again, thank you so much, Lisa. This was awesome.
Thank you all for attending. Okay, there are a few more questions in the chat box. Some bulbs can attract pollinators, absolutely. So you have to do research. Different bulbs may attract pollinators and others do not. For more specifics, Kathy, you and I can chat. Just send me an email. Zinnias can attract pollinators as well. Yes, zinnias can be a great pollinator-friendly option for the landscape. I cleared about 1,500 square feet in my yard last spring and planted 130 plants. Awesome. Through the Resource Central program. Do these plants need the soil amended each year? Most likely they do not need the soil amended. So especially if they were drought tolerant perennials, definitely look to make sure, but no, and you most likely do not need to amend the soil. They might need a fresh layer of mulch maybe, but you don't need to work in organic matter or anything. And if you have additional questions about that, let me know. Can you please elaborate on what you mean by watering deeply? Yeah, the best way to explain that, watering deeply, is contrasting that with how we water our turf grass. We water our turf grass up to 3 times a week usually, and we might water for like 10 minutes, per cycle, where when we're watering trees or perennials, we're going to water way less than that. Usually, depending on the plants and the scenario, it could be once a week, it could be once a month even. And you're just going to want to apply more water when you do water those plants or those trees, so the water can sink deep into the soil. So you want to make sure it's trickling down slowly into the soil, and then you're not going to water for a while after that. And so watering deeply compared to how we water our turf grass, it's very different. I had a larger than expected loss of native perennials planted last year that did not come back. What could cause this? The ultra cold temperatures in February, too much or too little winter water? Um, that's a great question, Rachel. Without knowing more, I would reach out to your local extension office to see if you could troubleshoot why that would happen. It's possible. I know I had a couple perennials that we think didn't make it because of the cold. They weren't well established yet. Um, they also, if we do have long periods without water during the winter, and it's a warm winter, they can benefit from winter watering. I don't know if that would kill them necessarily or not, but that's hard to say. If you have pictures and stuff, reach out to your extension office or send me an email and we can chat more about that. Can you share your, oh yeah, let me go back to the slides on trees for Michelle. I'm actually gonna do this. Okay, how about this one? Oops. All right, there's the water slides. Okay, and I think that's the last question. So I'll leave this up here for a minute. Thank you all again, and thank you for your patience. I know we did go over time, and I sure appreciate your attention tonight. And reach out with any other questions. Thank you all.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you all again. And thank you, Lisa. Again, great talk. And we hope to see all of you at a future event. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Sweet. Yeah. Thank you,
Okay.
Lisa. This was great. I think I'll go ahead and yeah, close the webinar now. So thank you so much.
All right, sounds great. Thanks, Allie.
Yeah. Have a great night.
You too. Bye.